Excellent. Okay, well, welcome to the Newlines Institute event on anti-government militias. My name is Caroline Rose. I am a senior analyst and head of Newlines Institute for Policy and Strategy Strategic Vacuums program at the Institute. Now, what we're going to talk about today is something that has received a lot of media attention, especially in the wake of the January 6th assault on the US Capitol. And it is also a key element of the Strategic Vacuums program as we study ungoverned spaces, particularly spaces where the US government has had a hard time controlling and enforcement to enact credibility and control. And this space can become, of course, easily exploitable but for malign actors such as far-right militias. So after, of course, the January 6th assault on the US Capitol, the rise of far-right groups in the US has become one of the most pressing issues for the US government under the Biden administration to address, especially as it tackles a widening ungoverned space and polarized politics. And I'm very pleased to be joined by some of the most foremost experts on this topic, domestic extremism, Dr. Cynthia Miller-Idriss, and of course, our non-residential fellows at the Newlines Institute for Strategy and Policy, Daryl Johnson and Alejandro Butel. Now I'm going to talk a bit about our speakers before we proceed to a set of questions. And I'm very excited to have them here. They've been leading this field with a series of very important work and books and reports and stories about how the US should tackle far-right extremism, and especially the global far-right movement. Now I'm going to start with Dr. Cynthia Miller-Idriss. She is a award-winning scholar and author on extremism and radicalism. She is the director of the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab at American University's Center for University Excellence here in Washington. Her work on extremist groups have made her one of the most foremost experts on domestic terror groups, having testified before Congress and briefed at an array of intelligence, education, and security agencies in the United States, including the United Nations and other countries as well. She's also the author and co-author and co-editor of a series of 6 books, the most recent being Hate in the Homeland, The New Global Far Right. Now I'm going to talk a bit about Daryl Johnson. He is a non-resident fellow here at Newlines Institute and is one of the top experts on domestic extremism groups in the United States. He is also, his career spans decades following and studying domestic terrorist groups, beginning his career in the US Army's Counterintelligence Center and having served with a number of governmental agencies, most recently as a senior analyst for the Department of Homeland Security. He is the author of Homeland, a long, hard look at Americans' extremist heart and right-wing resurgence, how a domestic, oh, sorry, I didn't get the last part, but right-wing resurgence. And we're also very pleased to have Alejandro Butel with us. He is an expert on nonviolent and not violent extremist groups, as well as Islamic movements and anti-Islamic movements as well. He is a former senior research analyst at the Southern Poverty Law Center and a former researcher for countering violent extremism at the University of Maryland's National Consortium for the Study of Responses to Terrorism. And he is currently a doctoral candidate at the University of Massachusetts at Lowell. Thank you all so much for joining us today. This is, of course, a very important topic and something that you all have been closely following before January 6th. And many of you have been warning about this for years, if not decades. And Newlines was very fortunate to have to sit down with Alejandro and Daryl a few weeks before, especially after the January 6th attacks, to talk about their initial reactions. Now it's March. And now the United States government and, of course, the American public, they've had some time to sit with some of the consequences of the January 6th attack and reflect on some of the policy responses that will be needed to step forward, especially as the US security landscape continues to evolve. Now, we're looking at a deficit of law enforcement credibility. We're looking at a deficit of governmental power and state credibility with a lot of these far-right groups. And of course, this is demonstrating a widening ungoverned space. Now, looking ahead, It's been, 2 months since this mob. It's been 2 months since this assault on the US Capitol. Both sides of the aisle have now tried to address what has happened. During this reflection period that we've seen since January 6th, we've seen a lot of renewed interest in the far right and the far right terror nexus, without much explanation of the individual groups and the layers of this movement that have really evolved since 2008 and since the 1990s. Alejandro and Daryl published a recent report on the 3%er movement that talked about the resurgence of these two different trends, particularly after 2008, where we've seen a sharp rise in some of these far right movements. Daryl and Alejandro, they defined 6 subsets of this movement: conspiracy propagandists, militias, tax protesters, sovereign citizens, far-right survivalists, and constitutional sheriffs. And Dr. Militias as well, she's also defined a different series of ideological subsets, such as anti-democraticism, set hierarchies, conspiracies, and violent groups. Now, how important do you think going forward, especially while the US tries to design a US policy, how important is terminology here in allowing both the public and policy communities to really understand the far right, their motives, their tactics, and how to set and design a policy going forward?
I'll go ahead and take a first crack at that question. Terminology is very important. We have inconsistent terminology even at the federal government level. So it's important to come up with a set of terminology that describes these various movements and their activities, because we need consistency. So when we talk about a certain type of threat, everybody understands what we're talking about. We also have to be sensitive to people's constitutional rights of free speech, assembly, and Second Amendment rights, things of this nature. So it's important to focus on not only the violence aspects of this problem, but also the criminal support network, people that make calls for violence or donate money and funds to these violent groups, as well as provide safe haven for them. We attempted to do this back in 2009. We developed the first of its kind domestic terrorism lexicon. Got a lot of pushback by conservatives in the media, and so they kind of pulled it back, did a relook, kind of fashioned the terminology a little bit to kind of enhance the violent and threatening activities of these groups. So I'm glad to see that the government's making attempts, and there's actually a renewed effort on the part of the government to kind of come up with some terms that's agreeable by everyone.
Yeah, I would just, I completely agree. So I'll keep my remarks short. I think we absolutely have a classification problem, both across the US between the way that we count and classify and understand what's happening within states across the federal agencies, which don't even use the same terminology. And then globally, of course, we don't have the same terminology or the same determination even of what constitutes whether an act was terrorism or domestic extremism or white supremacist extremism or something else, and right-wing extremism or right-wing terror. So it's problematic. It makes it really difficult to capture the scope of the problem. And also, I think we in this country in particular, but really globally as well, have trouble with the understanding in the policy circles and also in the media, the movement, the aspects of the movement that don't fall neatly into traditional group frameworks like the 3%ers. And it's one of the reasons why I was really glad that this report focused on that, because it's very difficult I think of them more like the Boogaloo as well, as a mobilizing concept, even more than a movement. It gets added like a hashtag to other movements. So you could have something like Proud Boys group with a social media post that then adds hashtag Boogaloo, which just means, a call to civil war. And I think the 3%ers works in some ways in the same way as a mobilizing concept, or kind of what they even sometimes themselves call meme-based mobilization. And that's a really difficult thing to wrap your head around if your traditional counterterrorism model is based on, hierarchical groups with cells and leaders. And even when groups do coalesce around the concept and are named, as the report indicates, it's not only about those groups, it's about things that are broader. And I think that's why we've seen on something like January 6th, only 13 15% of the arrests so far have come from people who are kind of card-carrying members of groups. So it's very difficult to kind of wrap our heads around that. And I think not just classifying what's happening in the phenomenon, but having a broader set of definitions to explain these phenomena that aren't just groups, but something more and broader and more amorphous than that would be very helpful, I think, to help the public and the policymakers understand this, as well as the media.
And I agree with my colleagues that terminology does matter substantially. Even if we look at the past several years in terms of how we've tried to advance as a country in the struggle against Islamist extremist networks, violent Islamist extremist networks, groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS and their affiliates, you know, we found that terminology matters. In the Abbottabad documents that were recovered from bin Laden's compound, one of the things that stuck out was the fact that the terminology and the strategic communication over a prolonged period of time did in fact have effects upon his behavior and his strategic thinking. And so there's something I think to be noted from that, even in applying this here domestically, that we want to make sure that, you know, not just in terms of what we do, but also what we say is to truly isolate the extremists from the broader populations that they're seeking to draw recruits from. So that's a very, very important thing that's there, because if we're lumping different groups together, all that does is it adds heat rather than light to the issue. And, you know, to the other point about, you know, differentiating in terminology, I think that's also coincides with making sure that we have an understanding of the different nuances and the different motivations that sometimes underwrite the various subsections of the various actors that comprise this larger far-right milieu. And as such, we need to make sure that policies are then calibrated accordingly to that. So what may work for one particular group of actors may not necessarily apply to another set of actors, even if they may at times perhaps you know, fit under this broader umbrella, if you will, of the far right. And yes, it's important to understand that the boundaries between these different movements, these different groups, these different actors, they overlap with each other quite often, but it's also important to understand that in this complicated sort of weave and web of different actors that are out there, we need to know where it overlaps and where things differentiate. And finally, I think that just brings us to one other fundamental thing, which is that it's reflective of whether or not we have a better understanding of the actual threat landscape. Understanding, of course, that we're trying to differentiate between foe and non-foe. Since we're, you know, in the United States, you know, under a liberal democratic order, at least we strive to be, we need to make sure that in a constitutionally consistent manner, our policies are calibrated in such a way that they're also carefully differentiating between lawful ideas and speech versus unlawful criminal activity. And that's also going to be key, because again, that goes back to the first point, which is we don't want to then give into the grievance narratives. We don't want to be giving any sort of propaganda ammo to any of these groups that would then say, oh, the government is engaging in overreach, and therefore you should feel some sort of sympathy for us. That is exactly the last thing that any policymaker would want to do in this sort of situation.
Thank you so much. Excellent answers. And I think the policy community is recognizing now that treating the far right as a monolith, as this one, you know, movement where they borrow different narratives and ideologies and identities, it's certainly true. And a lot of these traits are shared. And I remember in the report, the policy report on the 3%er movement, there was a diagram that showed how many different traits were shared, but at the same time, how their tactics and how their behaviors still differentiated each other from the rest and from their counterpart, and how some to an extent were more organized, and how there was a spectrum of this. So absolutely, you know, having US policy coordinate to this spectrum will be very important, especially for policymakers to tackle with that question. Now, one concern, and this goes back to the question of recruitment, which one of our speakers just brought up. One concern, especially with respect to far-right militias, is that elements of the US military and also elements of law enforcement have intimate ties and sympathies with some of these organizations. And this fear has been played out in the public sphere and within policy debates of how the United States should regulate this and how they should change recruitment tactics, how the US Department of Defense should also tackle this problem, how the US police enforcement and law enforcement system should also tackle this problem. And one of the main fears, of course, are these groups pulling from some of the operational, technical, and combat experience, some of the technical expertise that these individuals would have. But there is a bigger trend at play, and it is them pulling some of these members of the military and law enforcement to use for state credibility, to undermine governmental control, and to undermine citizens' trust in some of these institutions. And this is especially the case for anti-government militias that play off of some of these anxieties and these fears of US governmental control. Can you talk a bit more about this? And do you see this as a long-term blind spot for the United States, especially since militia activity has been particularly high since 2008, and it doesn't seem, especially with this polarized political system, with this landscape, that they're not really going to subside in the next few years? So I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
So this is a legacy issue. I mentioned it in my 2009 report, this connection between military members and militia groups and extremists. The first thing we need to just say from the very beginning is we're talking about a very small percentage, particularly in the white supremacy movements. I mean, we're talking less than 1/10 of 1% for white supremacists and military members. But the militia, as we've seen with the arrests from the Capitol insurrection, have a much larger percentage of military and police members. The last count I heard from American University, something like 20% of the 200 some odd people that have been arrested to date have had military experience, whether it was past or former or current. And then we had over 30 police officers that were off duty that attended that rally and participated in the violence that are under investigation. So how we need to handle this is, I think up until recently, everyone's been kind of hesitant to look at these infiltrators or participants because they were looking at primarily from a criminal aspect. But we need to broaden that into a more diversified threat. I would look at them as an insider threat, as a counterintelligence type of threat. And how I would deal with these people is administratively. If you find, we need to do enhanced social media monitoring of people that have clearances. We need to add questions to the SF-86 that zero in more specifically on support and participation and membership in these types of organizations. And of course, our clearance adjudicators, as well as the background investigators, need to be educated on these types of extremist groups so they can be aware of their violent activities and which groups are more prone to violence than others and which have more of a threat than others. So, that's how we need to tackle the problem. And people that are found to have, advocated criminal activity, issued threats against any types of communities, and they hold these positions, we need to hold these people to a higher standard. I mean, some of them are empowered to arrest and investigate people. Others are empowered to protect this country and are especially trained to do that. So these people need to be held to a higher standard of, for all their life and their activities, both on the job and off the job. Because as we've seen, when you have police officers that are wearing 3%er patches and standing on the front lines of, riot control, it undermines public trust because it shows that the police department is a permissive environment for these extremists to operate in. So that's my 2 cents on this issue, and I'll turn it over to my colleagues to see what other insights they have to add.
Yeah, I agree completely. I would just add a couple of things. One, I think that we have to look both at the issues of conscious and unconscious bias among, I mean, obviously that's being attended to. We're in a moment of a reckoning about that nationally, but in terms of as it plays out in these cases about like who's regarded as a threat, and how do we make threat assessments, and what, you know, and what who determines that, and how do threats get taken seriously. I think obviously January 6th is going to start to change that a little bit in this country, I hope. But also I think on the issue of the actual infiltration, so not just unconscious bias, but real engagement in the military and in law enforcement. I think, again, here there are models overseas. We don't have to completely reinvent the wheel. There has been a massive investigation going on in Germany all year because of repeated scandal after scandal that they've had, including having to disband an entire platoon in their special forces because too many of them were found to have far-right extremist sympathies. And in fact, munitions went missing from that platoon and still are missing. And so there, you know, and there it's also about 1%, I think, or less than 1% of the, you know, of the total population of the intelligence and security officers, at least in terms of the 1,300 cases that were found so far. But, you know, I agree with Daryl. I think what their defense minister said was, look, every case is a scandal, even if it's a small percentage. These are people who have to be held to a higher standard. They are charged with safeguarding the public. They have military grade weapon, you know, training, and are better equipped and are therefore more dangerous. So I think on the one hand, we need, and in the German case, they have an independent military agency that's tasked with just rooting out extremism in the military across all of its divisions. I don't know that that's the direction we want to go, but that is the kind of attention I think that the issue deserves, and that requires also transparency and reporting back to the public, which we have always lacked. And so I think, you know, more data collection, as we just heard, the kinds of questions that could be asked, but also more transparency back to the public about what was found. And finally, I think there needs to be a plan, particularly on the military side, for what happens after you find that. So is it just kicked further down the line to the veterans community, where we know there's already a disproportionate problem, you know, compared to the number of veterans in the country, with the number who showed up, have been arrested so far for January 6th, and repeatedly in other incidents as well, at least anecdotally, there is a problem in the veteran community. And again, the vast majority of veterans not a part of this, but we know that they're disproportionately affected or vulnerable in some way. And I think we need more resources to Veterans Affairs communities in order to really properly address that, if we're going to be potentially, you know, dismissing more people from the military as cases come up. What does it mean for the Veterans Affairs without the resources then to support that and really understand what people need in order to either disengage or de-radicalize or have the kinds of supports that are needed. So transparency, reporting, but also support for veterans and veterans local communities, I think, are critical here.
Just to build off of my colleagues' 3 quick points. One, I think, again, is to sort of emphasize here the importance of making sure that policies that are taken are constitutionally consistent. And I think it's important here to, you know, make clear to the audience that, for example, taking administrative action up to the point of, for instance, firing individuals or disbanding them, discharging them from their duties as a military officer or as a law enforcement official, are actually constitutionally permissible. There have been court cases that have decided this. And I think that's very, very important to understand, because oftentimes one of the first things that people may think is, well, what about First Amendment protections and things like that? But again, the courts have ruled that this is a case where there is a certain level of balancing that needs to take place. And I won't get into the details of it. It's in our report, which I would invite everyone to read, but it's just something that I think is important for audience members here to understand. You know, the second thing as well is to go to tying into Dr. Miller-Idris's and Daryl's points about insider threats and threat assessments. I also want to return to the issue of fusion centers as well in this country, which are sort of like these regional and local entities that bring together different first responder departments and try to fuse together, hence the term fusion center, but fuse together different pieces of information to provide a more holistic intelligence picture. And this was based on the premise that the 9/11 attacks had happened because what? We had failed to connect the dots. And so this is an attempt at a state, local, and tribal level to try and connect the dots and provide that threat landscape, that better threat landscape and picture to local, state, and tribal law enforcement entities. Now, that said, though, fusion centers have been an object of controversy for quite a substantial amount of time, pretty much since they were first conceived of and enacted. And so on the one hand, you have some advocates that have said, oh, these are great, they're very helpful because of what I just described, what they're intended to do. On the other hand, there are those who say they may have been intended to do this, but on the other hand, though, there have been a number of different problems with them, including, among other things, violations of privacy, civil rights, and civil liberties. And so there have been a number of different attempts to try and fix the fusion centers over the years. Why I bring this up and to tie this directly to this discussion here is because when we're talking about the issue of law enforcement infiltration here, one of the things to understand is that, for instance, during the nationwide George Floyd-inspired protest, the anti-racism protest that we saw last summer, there was a lot of disinformation that was going around about potential Antifa riots coming to various local towns and cities across the country. And this was basically mass disinformation that was out there that basically made a mountain of hysteria off of a hill of actual violence that was taking place in very, very specific locales across the country. And so part of how that disinformation spread was through fusion centers. And so part of where this becomes an issue is that if there are far-right actors that are in law enforcement right now and potentially then in fusion centers, we have to wonder and ask ourselves, among some of the insider problems and threats that are there, among the fact that, of course, you have these individuals that have the power of surveillance and arrest, among other things as well is, are they also contributing to the pollution of intelligence streams in this country and muddying the picture of the threat landscape itself? And that's something very important. And to add one other variable to this. So we talk about law enforcement infiltration. And the image that often comes to mind is, say, someone who harbors, some unexpressed extremist views, applies for a job at a local law enforcement agency, makes their way through the academy, gets their badge and gun, and is on the force, working the beat. But, somewhere along the lines, they, will slap a 3-per patch or maybe, an Othala rune somewhere, if they're a white supremacist or other things like that. What I want to draw attention to, and this gets back to your earlier remarks, Caroline, about differentiating between different elements of the far right and even different elements of the anti-government movement. One of the other major sort of first cousins within the anti-government movement to militias is a movement known as the constitutional sheriffs. I know Daryl, for instance, is very familiar with them as well, and Dr. Miller Idris is as well. And so the constitutional sheriff movement, basically they believe in, among other things, that they have the right to nullify any laws that they don't believe to be constitutional. They believe essentially in many ways that they are the supreme law of the land, okay? And this gets into all kinds of sort of complicated things in history, and far-right ideology. But the point that I'm bringing up here is that these far-right sheriffs, how they get themselves into law enforcement isn't through this standard picture of what we think of as infiltration per se, clandestine entry into, some sort of department. They're elected officials. They run on a ballot. They run openly for elections. And so according to a recent report by Political Research Associates, which is a think tank in the Boston area that monitors the far right, they found that there are about approximately 161 anti-government extremist aligned sheriffs across the country. And so if we calculate that out of a total of 3,081 elected county sheriffs nationwide, that's literally just over 1 out of every 20 elected county sheriffs in this country. So, you know, to put a data point on this issue here, and to also, you know, add a little extra complication to when we're thinking about the relationship between the far right and their attempts to enter into law enforcement, first responders, and military. This is also something that policymakers have to keep in mind and consider. And so it's not just going to be about, administrative action. In many cases as well, it's going to take grassroots organizing and defeating a lot of these individuals at the ballot box as well.
Great points. And just to build off of that, clearly January 6th, it was a landmark moment where I think a lot of policymakers and a lot of members of law enforcement and intelligence recognized that this is a problem that has fermented and it has spread under the surface for years, if not decades. And now the policy community has to look forward and realize and recognize ways to not only counter these groups, but also be proactive about them. Now, Daryl, you wrote an op-ed in Newlines magazine, I believe a week or two ago, describing your own personal experience within law enforcement, within governmental agencies as an intelligence expert, warning a number of US governmental agencies about the threat of far-right groups, particularly militias. And you know, the article's headline even said that many of these pleas, many of these rung alarms, they were ignored. And so now I think that, you know, after January 6th, it's clear that this has been a wake-up call. But how exactly do you think the United States can be proactive about countering these groups? And I also want to tie in something else. And I know that Dr. Militias, you've done work on not only policy responses, but also educational responses. And you've studied the German model of far-right extremism and the youth far-right and that cultural phenomenon. So tying in that as well, tying in awareness campaigns, tying in some of the more cultural and everyday aspects of countering these groups, how can the US be proactive about that?
I'll go ahead and address just a few ideas. I mean, obviously, we pointed out a few policy recommendations in the 3%er paper, but beyond that, this new administration, I think, has set a good tone. I hope they follow through with it, but just starting with recognizing the threat, calling it out, and also being equitable about calling out all forms of violent, ideologically motivated extremism. Calling these ideologically motivated events terrorism is also a good point, because we can start collecting data and better assess what the threat is and where it's headed. But this needs to be, you know, a top-down approach and a bottom-up approach from not only the federal government and the various agencies and the politicians and the president, but also, you know, state and local governments, but also down on the community level. You know, people can form watch groups and educate themselves on this topic and interact with their legislators and the police department and media, and kind of build these relationships of trust, and, you know, write op-ed pieces or write letters to your politicians if you've got an extremism issue in your communities. As people, you know, we need to, you know, reach out and embrace our own family members and coworkers, close friends that are members of these extremist beliefs, and kind of reacclimate them back into the fold through love and compassion, and you know, through interest, rather than ostracizing and, you know, keeping them at arm's length as kind of human tendency. You know, we want to avoid conflict and things like this, but it really takes, you know, some effort and heart to go towards somebody that you love and, you know, bring them back, reacclimate them back into society. I also believe in this, that we should have a national program in our schools that's anti-hate, just like we have anti-bullying programs and anti-gang and anti-drug programs. We need to incorporate an aspect of, you know, educating our youth about the dangers of extremism and conspiracy theories and name calling and scapegoating and all these things that go on in these extremist communities that propagate radicalization and recruitment efforts. So, you know, there needs to be a holistic approach training programs need to be instituted like we had in the aftermath of Oklahoma City, the state and local anti-terrorism training program, which was defunded in 2017. We have no national level program to educate not only state and local governments, but also faith-based communities and other targets about these threats.
Yeah, I will just build on that because I very much agree, obviously, especially on the need for more education-based and intervention prevention-based programming and the resources that have to go along with it. I would just add that we also need evidence about what works and what doesn't work. And, you know, we saw this a lot with counter-narrative work against, you know, in the post 9/11 context with Islamist and religious, you know, oriented terrorism and extremism, that a lot of ideas were thrown out without evidence. And one of the things we know, especially when you get to conspiracy theories, is that trying to counter them with facts actually can make things worse. And so I think, you know, we just finished this, we're creating a series in my research lab, a series of tools in partnership with the Southern Poverty Law Center. And the first one that came out was a parents and caregivers guide. We just finished the impact study of that. So we're studying it as we go to see how does it affect. And results won't be public for a couple of weeks, but I can say the great news is that it was effective really on every measure. But the thing I'm most proud of is the more time parents spent reading the guide, the better they got at recognizing. So it was, you know, minutes mattered, right? Like if they spent 5 minutes, they learned something. If they spent 10 minutes, it was better. And, you know, what we learned is that they need, if you're expecting parents to be able to intervene, they need the knowledge and the skills, but they also need to feel more empowered on how they can do it. And they need to know where to go for resources. And one of the things that we haven't done a very good job of, I think, like we have had anti-bullying, anti-gang programs in schools, we also have, you know, relatively quick, Googleable, searchable places to get resources for sexual assault, for addiction, for, you know, other problems that young people and young adults in particular will run into. And if their parents want help or communities want help, they know what 1-800 number to call, or a child themselves can text, you know, a text helpline and get resources on depression or suicide. We don't have those kinds of things, or if they are emerging, right? We do have programs like Life After Hate and also in Parents for Peace, but they are not well known to most parents. And so you get parents Googling and then finding somebody like me, just a random professor, and asking for help. You know, I mean, the level of desperation you have to reach out to a professor on campus. And that I'm not the only one. I know a lot of professors who study this, faculty who get calls from parents, from siblings, from, you know, people who just teachers, principals, who are at that point, by the time they find me, it's so far down the pipeline that all those early warning signs didn't get detected. So I think finding the ways to test interventions, to create out of the box ideas, but also really inform local communities on where resources are and how they can be more empowered so that we can sort of stem this. And just to go back to, you know, overseas models, when Germany had a storming of their parliament in August as well, and the extreme militia, far-right militias made it past the first cordon of police before they were thwarted. 3 months later, obviously in the works for a long time, but 3 months later, the government passed the most sweeping legislation ever to combat, you know, globally, to combat not just right-wing extremism, but racism and right-wing extremism. So seeing those two things as intertwined with €1 billion, 89 specific measures, many of which are targeting education, research, interventions, also better surveillance and communication and coordination across agencies, and more transparency for the public. You know, I think after 9/11, we end up with the Department of Homeland Security. We don't necessarily need an entire agency, but I think we need that scale of response at this point. We need to think about involving, you know, health and human services and education and social work and you know, what are the broad range so that this isn't just a law enforcement and security approach, but is really more a broader 360 whole of society kind of approach.
Just to, I think, build off of what my colleagues were saying, and I really am glad to hear, you know, the work that Dr. Militias is doing in Peril, because it's so extremely, extremely important. And it brings me to something that I just also want to point out here, because there's a lot of times that there's discussions about radicalization that are thrown around and recruitment and whatnot. And sometimes these terms are used and bandied about without necessarily understanding, and they can sort of sometimes scare people, and they may have their uses, but in other times they can get really scary and obscure rather than illuminate. And I think in this case, some of the work that Dr. Miller Idris is doing through Peril, and one of your advisory board members is actually a friend of mine and colleague. And so, I hear a lot of the good things to that individual. And, one thing I think that's also important in all this is that there's been a lot of discussion as of late about like online radicalization. And one thing that I think is also important that Dr. Miller Idris and Peril is doing really well is that while they're certainly, I think, interfacing with the online component, the fact that they're doing something designed for parents and caregivers also is stressing the importance of what happens offline. We focus a lot on the digital devices, and we often tend to forget about the people behind them. And I think that's really, really sort of important to remember, that these are human beings. They live in certain communities. They come, from certain different backgrounds that are there. And so making sure that, there's a way that, yes, especially as we become, ever more interconnected in a globalized society, we have to keep that online component. But, as a parent myself, there's nothing like a little bit good old fashioned parenting as well. And just helping, caregivers, giving them the right kinds of tools, to help guide our next generation in the right productive path. And as a social scientist, by the way, empirically, that seems to be the most sound, promising way to do it. So, that's my comment, but it's also a kudos as well to Dr. Miller Idris and the work that they do at Peril.
Excellent. Well, I think we've got room for about one or two more questions. One thing I want to ask is,